And now we get to our well-known speaker, one person I call the curator and the chronicler of Nashville and Tennessee history. Most all of you know who he is, Jim Hoobler.
Some of you were at the talk I gave yesterday on George Barnard. Those are all photographs out there in the lobby that he shot in Nashville in 1864. Today we're going to jump up about a decade or two further into the 19th century with work by two German Americans who lived in Nashville. Karl Giers, who came over from Bonn, Germany, and established his photographic studio at 3rd and Dedrick Street about 8 years before the Civil War. And then the German couple across the street in a flu epidemic died from influenza, and he adopted their two children. And Karl Giers then raised Otto Burkhardt, who became Otto Giers, his adopted son. And together they photographed the city from about the mid-1850s till almost 1900. So they're quite the chroniclers of our city's architectural history. I found out about the collection when Ann Reynolds Roberts and Maydeen Eberling told me when I was working on John Edgerton's book, The Faces of Two Centuries, trying to get illustrations for it, that Sarah Hunter Green was the granddaughter of Otto and the great-granddaughter then of Karl, and she had hundreds of his photographs at her home. And so I introduced myself and went out there, and Sarah became a good friend, and she was after me for a couple of years to do a book on the Giers. Well, it wound up being 2 books on the Giers, and you're going to see some of the fruit of that labor today. This is Karl, and he was the Tennessee delegate to an international exposition in Vienna about 10 years before his death, representing the state of Tennessee and some of its industrial and artistic gifts. This is his adopted son, Otto. He was from the uniform. You can tell he was part of Porter's Rifles. It was a men's drill team. In the 1870s and 80s, I guess men were bored with peace, so they practiced war by dressing up and marching around and doing rifle drills. Otto was part of that generation. One of the remarkable things that Tennessee did following the Civil War was in 1871, we did an international exposition, and it was industrial. And Adelicia Ackland loaned Sabrina one of her garden sculptures to the exposition. She also loaned some of her artwork, and Mark Brown has been looking at these for a number of years trying to figure out which one of these belonged to Adelicia. It also had a large floral and botanical component, and Adelicia's third husband, William Archer Cheatham, was an avid gardener. He was the head of the state insane asylum, and some of you probably remember the asylum out on Murfreesboro Road near where the airport is. He had a large glass house out there where he grew exotic things. In one of the pictures later, I'll show you one of the exotics he raised. But we know that he loaned some of his garden plants to this exposition. More of the artwork from the show. And more artwork, and one of the cast iron fountains we think might have been something of Adelicia's as well. This building stood at the corner of 8th and Broadway, where later the Nashville Centennial Exposition was held. This is the pre-Civil War Iron Truss rail bridge that crossed the Cumberland, and here's the Nashville side of it. This is part of Adolphus Hyman's passenger rail terminal in the castellated Gothic style. It stood between Charlotte and Church Street. And as you're going out Charlotte to the west, you know that big stone wall where the railroad goes over it? That's where this was located. This is the suspension bridge, which was actually the second bridge to cross the Cumberland. There was one put up about 1828. German engineer named Wernwag designed it. And it was like the one that he had done in New Hope, Pennsylvania some years before that. That was a five-pier bridge across the river up in Pennsylvania. Ours only had 2 piers. A couple of years ago, some people that I knew that were of Cherokee ancestry had been trying to trace the Trail of Tears. And they followed it in to where it would have come in on the north side of the public square. And lo and behold, there on the river bluff are one of the surviving piers from that 1820s bridge, which about 10 years later, the Trail of Tears crossed over to get into Nashville. So Jeff Sellers, one of my friends at the State Museum, I had Jeff come with me down there to see it. And fortunately, Jeff's wife worked for the Department of Transportation, TDOT. And TDOT owned that land. There was a homeless encampment on top of the bridge pier. And they cleaned it up, fenced it off, and we've alerted the feds that it's part of the Trail of Tears, so they're recognizing it now on that federally recognized route. This is an interesting view of the Cumberland in flood, and if you look at it, you can see Samuel Dold Morgan's cotton factory there, Tennessee Manufacturing, and on the hill out there in the distance, you can see St. Cecilia Mother House, which had just been begun just prior to the Civil War. It was designed by Harvey Ackroyd, the English architect who also designed the Ansley Building down on the south side of the public square and the State Library Chamber in the State Capitol Building. This is one of the means of transportation in that period, a little packet boat going down the Cumberland, and you can see our suspension bridge there in the background, which is where the Woodland Street Bridge is today. This is a structure that Adolphus Hyman altered. He added a 3rd floor to it, gave it sort of an Italianate flair. This was City Hall and also the city market, the farmer's market. And if you look down there, one of the ways I was able to date this one is it's announcing that Buffalo Bill Cody is coming to town. And sure enough, he did. Interestingly, this building also played a part in my identifying the oldest now known photograph of downtown Nashville. It was shot by a Belgian engineer who had come here to investigate Tennessee, and on the back in French it just said the Nashville Market. Well, the museum, being taxpayer funded, had no money at that point, so we had to pass on buying it. But my buddy Clara Hieronymus couldn't let it go, so she did a whole big piece in the Tennessean about this wonderful photograph and what a shame Tennessee was going to lose it, and didn't we need to do something? So we got a call from one of the museum board members, Landis Gullett, and she pledged to help purchase it. So I knew her running buddies, so I called some of her lady friends, and we raised the money. We got it. But in that photograph, it showed the Nashville market in the early 1850s as designed not by Hyman, but by Hughes. And on the opposite side of it, at the corner of 3rd and Dedrick, you could see a sign on a building, GIE. And I knew that at that location is where Carl Giers had his studio, so we could date it to about 1854. This was the city jail and city health department. It was north of the public square. And this is the southeast side of the public square. Look at those beautiful buildings. All of these, some of you might remember some of these. I came here in 1972, and the north side of the square was still there at that point, but most of it had been demolished over the years, unfortunately. The large building there with the mansard roof was the Southern Methodist Publishing House, and it was on the east side of the public square on the bluff there by the bridges. This is the corner of 2nd and or Market Street and Broad, or 2nd and Broad. This whole side of the street was cut back in the 1930s because we were no longer just unloading riverboats and then rolling them in the backside there on 1st Avenue and selling them out of the 2nd Avenue side. We now had semi-truck trailers, and they needed a lot more turning room than 2nd Avenue had, so they demolished the whole facades from Broadway up to Church Street of all those Victorian buildings to make the street a wider avenue. This building has just recently been totally gutted, what was left of it after the demolition of the 2nd Avenue side, and it's being redeveloped for other purposes now, probably more country bars. This is the corner, yeah, here we go again. This is the corner of 3rd and Union, and you can see Poles is right in here. He was a jeweler, and there was also Poole's Photography there at that location. This is a building that, this is in a collection that the State Museum acquired, and I haven't done research on this one yet, but it intrigues me. It's a beautiful building with that colonnade in the middle, and I'll have to get down into the museum collections and see if I can figure out what that is. This is the corner of 5th and Church, and Kermit Stengel was a friend of mine, and he owned this building and a taller one that went up next to it in the 1890s. And it was announced that Kermit was going to rehab that building. Being a member of the Downtown Presbyterian Church, I was hoping that he would do more than rehab. I hoped he would restore. So I called him and said, "Do you need help in finding information about the history of that building?" He said, "Well, I've already paid somebody. She couldn't find anything." Well, where did she look? In the Banner and the Tennessean. "Kermit, there was a 3rd newspaper. Let me check the Daily American." There was a whole newspaper page about the opening of Nashville's first large department store, Connell Hall in McLester. It had floor plans, and it had some wood engravings of some of the interior. And when Kermit and I were going through this building, you could see in one of the engravings a staircase and a window. And as we were on the 2nd floor, I said, "You see that outline there? That's the staircase that you see in this engraving, and that walled up window, that's this one." And your idea that you were going to put a skylight in there, you don't need to. It was originally there. It went almost to the 1st floor. What happened in the 1940s when Fred Harvey came down from Chicago and opened Harvey's department store, he accessed that light well as the site for Nashville's first escalator. This is 6th Avenue, and there's one of my favorite lost buildings in Nashville, the temple on 6th Avenue. It used to be the joke there. On one side of it, it had the Vine Street Christian Church, and on the other side, it had Church of the Advent. So the question was, what separates the Church of the Advent from Vine Street Christian? The Old Testament. This was on Monroe Street, the 600 block of Broadway, so very close to where you see all of those honky-tonks and things now on busy weekends. But remember, Nashville was so small for so long. Remember how much we grew in the 19th century. For example, in 1860, the population was only 16,000 people. And the city of Nashville was concentrated between the Capitol Hill slope and College Hill slope, where 2nd Avenue is now, the old Howard School complex. And from that hill down to what we now call the Gulch. Everything was pretty much in that area. All of the commercial, the residential, the religious structures, warehouses, everything was focused in there. You had some suburban tracts like Germantown, you had the separate city of Edgefield. But even when you add all of that, by 1860, we only had close to 30,000 people. So it was very, very compact and concentrated. Otto was also very interested in a big snowstorm we had, and this is where you're going to go tomorrow. That is the steeple to the German Catholic Church of the Advent out at 7th and Monroe Street. Assumption, sorry. But this is part of Otto's paraphernalia for getting around with his bulky camera and everything. And the state capitol building was always something that intrigued me. I'd started working around it in 1974. So after almost 50 years of dealing with politicians, I gave up and retired in 2020. But Doug Henry was an old friend of mine. We went to church together, and I knew that the senator loved Tennessee history. So back in the mid-'80s, I noticed that after 10 years of wandering the halls up there, not a whole lot of maintenance had been going on with the Capitol. The roof was leaking, some of the painted ceilings were dissolving and running down the walls, and it was pretty shameful, the condition it was in. The State Library, they had plywood panels closing off all of the upper balcony level. Things they couldn't figure out what to do with, they just piled up there. And conveniently, they had several sofas that were not occupied. The floor was largely threadbare from a putting green carpet that was in there. The cartons hadn't been changed since the 1950s, and when they were installed then, they weren't lined, so they were so rotten they were falling in piles on the floor up there. So I made a list of all of the deterioration that I'd spotted up there, took it to Senator Henry. He took it to Governor Alexander. He created a Capital Restoration Commission, and I worked as an advisor to them until I retired in 2020. And since then, we've done a couple more renovations up there. This is some of the grounds of the Capitol, again, in that snowstorm. When was the last time Nashville did that? Oh, yeah, about 1951. More of the grounds on a clearer day. And remember, this was essentially Nashville's first public park, because when it was laid out, it had walkways, it had sculpture, it had fountains, it had specimen trees. So this was a green lung for the city of Nashville. When we started the restoration, I knew Sarah had these photographs out at Devon Farm, and I knew I had to get copies of them for the restoration. This one was a fun one. Right in the middle of the hall, there are spittoons lining the entire length of the hallway from one door in the south to the north at about 10-foot intervals. There's a hand-lettered sign that says, "Do not spit on the floor or the steps." And this confirmed an English lady's account of visiting the Capitol in 1875. She was English and sort of in the vein of Dickens or Thackeray. She had lots of catty things to say about rude, crude, and bumptious Tennesseans, and one of which was how slippery the floors were up there. This is my favorite room in the building. Not the most historic, but my favorite room. This is the State Library chamber. And notice the curtain that goes up the staircase. That's so you, Kim, can't see that librarian's ankles as she's going up there to pull that book you need to look at. And if you look at these rooms in the Capitol, how did they heat them? Well, it was a rudimentary system. Strickland was trying to use the same thing Rome had used 2,000 years earlier, the hypocaustic system. So in the area that was called the crypt, which is now the basement to the Capitol, it's not an original space, they excavated about 3 feet more down into the live rock of the hill, matching every one of those stone piers that supports the entire weight of the hundreds of tons of rock and people that are above it, to make working space. Well, at one end of that was the state arsenal, and at the other end you had big fires. Did you ever hear of Guy Fawkes? Apparently they hadn't. So the fires were to use the Roman system. Where does hot air go? It goes up into flues, it goes under your floor and heats some of the rooms. Well, maybe on the executive floor that would do something with about a 14-foot ceiling, some individual fireplaces, but on the second floor, 42-foot ceilings, that's hopeless. So like the library chamber had no fireplaces in it. Oh yeah, it's full of paper. The House chamber had no fireplaces in it, but at the opposite ends of the visitors' galleries in the outer walls, each of those rooms had a fireplace, which in the 1950s they walled up when they destroyed them. But in here, they've inserted a potbelly stove, so there's some heat in there by the 1880s. And this was the headquarters of the Tennessee Historical Society from when they moved into the building in 1854. While it's still a construction site, it wasn't finished till 1859, until the state told them to leave in the 1880s. So the Historical Society took all of their books, their manuscripts, their artifacts, their portraits of the governors up to that point, and moved to the Watkins Institute. And they were down there until the 1920s, when the state decided they would play better with the Historical Society and make a partnership with them with a trust agreement accepting the collections into the state's care. And of course, they've done a lot better since then. We have a new state library and a new state museum.
What's this room used for,
When we restored it, we wanted it to be sort of a museum space, so we purchased antiques from the period. In some of the old photographs, you could see a Roman Revival marble round table with not pinned, but independently standing lion's head and lion paw foot legs to it. The Senate decided they were going to have parties in there and luncheons, and they tried to move that. It's not pinned. If you don't watch it, it will fall and you will break it. So I removed all of the antiques from that room. If you can't play with the toys, you don't get the toys. This is one of the things that was in there. This was a life-size portrait of Felix Grundy that was commissioned by his descendants about 10 years after his death. Well, how do you do that? So they remembered that Cooper had done a portrait of him as a younger man, not that young, probably in his 50s, but younger than at death. And in that, he's wearing a yellow waistcoat. Do you know the symbolism of yellow waistcoats for those 19th century dandies? Goethe, the German author Goethe. One of his first books was The Sorrows of Young Werther, and he's a dandy, he's a ladies' man, he's in love, she won't have anything to do with him. So what do you do in a 19th century romance novel? You kill yourself. But he always wore a yellow waistcoat. So there's Felix Grundy, the rotund Attorney General of the United States, in his yellow waistcoat. So they copied that and they added a lower torso to him to be a life-size portrait, and they had that one done by George Dury. When I went to work at the museum, I found that portrait in tatters in a crate. It had fallen off the wall, it had punched out half of his face, and whoever the Bubba du jour was that day in charge of maintenance up there didn't pick up that half a face and save it. So I thought, well, it's an important piece, and let me see if I can do something about it. So I raised some money and got about halfway to the goal. I put it back into playing. We had cleaned it and stabilized it, and then I needed somebody to come forward and help put the face back in and finish the process. So Rod Heller had come to town. He was a descendant of Felix Grundy, and he was working on a biography on him for LSU Press. And Kay and Rod had me out to the house to talk about that and what could I find to illustrate the book for them. And I said, well, I've told you about all that I know except one piece. And let me share that piece with you now. And I said, but I need about $15,000 more to finish the project. And Kay said, we'll do it. So it's back in one piece and was exhibited when we left the former museum site down at TPAC. One of the interesting things below it, though, is this. This is the Egyptian mummy. How many of you remember seeing the mummy in the State Museum? Well, it was in the Capitol originally because a political appointee to the Navy, Jeremiah George Harris, who was appointed to the Navy by President Polk, he was in Alexandria, Egypt, and he was getting a tour of the city by one of the Turkish governor's officials. They were assaulted, and he drove them off. So the Turk's very grateful. What can I do for you? And he said, I'm a member of the Tennessee Historical Society. How about a mummy? When they were getting ready to leave Alexandria, a big crate was brought on board. When they opened it in Boston, the customs officials seized a mummy and sent one back home to Tennessee. So that's our mummy. This was one of the remarkable finds in Sarah's cache of photographs. This is the missing gasolier in the Tennessee House of Representatives. Strickland, being from Philadelphia, used wooden Perrott for a lot of the ornamental metalwork in the Capitol. He used the Cornelius Company, the premier gaslight manufacturer in the country, to manufacture the gasoliers for the building. Incidentally, a chandelier isn't that. A chandelier has a wax candle in it. It's French, chand, candle. Gasolier is the next step up. And the next step after that, which nobody ever agreed to use, was electrolier. But this thing was a celebration of Tennessee, where it was, where we came from. Down here, there is a circle of American bison, buffalo. We had herds of buffalo right here in Nashville out at the Mineral Springs where the Bicentennial Mall is. Down here, it had Native Americans and corn plants. Corn, cotton, and tobacco were the three main cash crops Tennessee raised. Up here, these are tobacco plants in blossom, and it was circled at the top with American eagles. That survived from the 1850s to the mid-1880s when the Shelby County delegation was sitting under it, and it made those poor, sad people nervous. So they got the rest of the House members to vote to take it down. It was hacked to bits. Members carted off pieces of it as trophies. And the Historical Society and the museum over the years have acquired maybe 6 Native Americans, a couple of corn plants, and some tobacco blossoms. But from this, we know what it looked like, and it could be reproduced. Moving on, the State Insane Asylum. These were the gates going into the asylum where Dr. Cheatham, Adelicia's third and final husband, was the director of the establishment. These are some of his therapeutic gardens that he had so that the patients there could wander in nature and enjoy the beautiful outdoors. There was also a pond. I'm not sure I would want a pond at an insane asylum, but there was a pond out there as well. And here's what I was alluding to earlier. This is his glass house. And do you see these? Do you know what those are? Victoria Regina water lilies from the Amazon River Basin. So he was getting pretty far afield in his exotic plants there. This is one of the hallways in the asylum. And this is another state institution. As you're going out Hermitage Avenue, you know where those new apartments are and where General Hospital used to be? You know that stone wall that's just beyond there? That's what was there until it was demolished, probably in the 60s. But the old Tennessee School for the Blind. Beautiful, beautiful Victorian buildings. This is another one of our medical establishments, the University of Nashville Medical School. Do you know where the apartments are that now are called Bode? It's like they've dropped A out of where you live, but they just call it Bode. That's where the University of Nashville Medical School was. This was another Adolphus Hyman building. He built it in the 1840s. It's sort of classical revival. This is the back side of it. That school, of course, in time closed. The University of Tennessee moved a medical school here. It was on Lower Broadway for a few years until it went over to Knoxville with where the main university is. This is the William Gordon residence. It stood about where Hillsborough Village is now in the old Peabody campus. This was taken over after the Civil War by the Northern Baptists, and it became Roger Williams University, one of the 3 establishments in Nashville for educating the newly freed, formerly enslaved people. And that campus caught fire, and Peabody then decided to relocate from South Nashville to that location on about half of the size of the property. As you're going down Broad, where it terminates at Vanderbilt, this was the front gate, and those piers are still there. The front entrance to Vanderbilt wasn't on West End, it was at the terminus of Broad. And that guy there is guarding it. Are you allowed to come onto this campus, and are you going to behave yourself? This is Wesley Hall, and it was one of the big dormitory buildings on campus. It burned about 1932, and there's some pretty dramatic photographs of it burning down. That big lawn that's between Rand Hall and West End, that's where this building had stood. Another historic structure. St. Bernard Convent owned it at this point. That's why it has a cross and a little tower on it. But this is fascinating. This was the home of George Washington Campbell, who owned Capitol Hill. That house stood on top of Capitol Hill. In 1843, the governor who had just been elected was a Whig. His name was James Jones. He went by Lean Jimmy. And Lean Jimmy investigated our Constitution from 1834, and he saw that the legislature had only 9 years in which to pick a permanent seat of government for Tennessee. What do you think they'd done in 9 years? Nothing. So he told them, this is your last year to pick a capital seat, and there was a big contest. Of course, Murfreesboro wanted to be capital because they're almost dead center. Problem with Murfreesboro, they're on the Stones River. You can't get a boat up and down the Stones River, but you sure could with a packet boat on the Cumberland. So another inducement, the mayor of Nashville was named for Pocahontas's father. He was Powhatan Maxey. And Powhatan went to Judge Campbell and said, the city of Nashville will give you $30,000. Can you imagine that in 1850s dollars or 40s dollars? That's huge. I want to buy the whole hill from you as bait, sort of like the golden apple, as bait for you to choose Nashville as the capital city. It worked. We are the capital. So his house was moved somehow down the hill across Charlotte to where those steps are going down onto the Legislative Plaza now. And there it sat until about 10 years into the 20th century, when James Caldwell, a financier and businessman in Nashville, came up with the idea, you know, Fort Negley is pretty interesting. I think we ought to have it restored, and I think it ought to be a national park, and I think we ought to build a boulevard. We'll call it Capitol Boulevard. It'll run from the Capitol all the way to Fort Negley. It got 3 blocks. He never convinced, even though we had the Speaker of the House of Representatives from Nashville, he never convinced the feds to make it into a park. But his son, Rogers, was appointed to the Parks Board, and Rogers got the parks to get the WPA to totally rebuild Fort Negley. And then the city let it fall into ruin again. This is a very, to me, significant photograph. This is the original configuration. If that came down a little bit further, you could see the altar. But this is the interior of St. Mary's of the Seven Sorrows Catholic Cathedral for the state of Tennessee. It's still standing at 5th in Charlotte. The bishops had been to Rome too many times, so they got ambitions of having a basilica. So they destroyed the gasolier, they destroyed the paintings. These effigies are painted on the walls of cenotaphs for the first bishop to be buried there, Bishop Miles. He was right under that altar, which they also removed. They removed the whole ceiling and put paintings in the ceiling. But this is the original configuration of St. Mary's. This is a building Kim is very familiar with. He worked on it and in it for a number of years. This is Elm Street Methodist Church, and that's about half the height of its steeple. It used to have a very, very tall steeple. This is down on 5th Avenue near Lafayette, and this is the church that Tom Ryman went to. This is the interior of that church, the original interior with the pipe organ. Before Kim bought it, there was a telemarketing company in there, and they got Miles Maley to do paintings on both sides of a church choir. And when they folded, they gave all of those to the State Museum, and I went down and picked them up. This is the original Hermitage. And in 1889, the night that before the ladies were to take ownership of the Hermitage, or administration of it, at least for the state, a storm came through, and that chimney fell down. So this is after that and after they've patched it back up. But that's half the size of the original Hermitage. The Jacksons lived in that, and it originally was a 2-story log cabin. These are cabins for some of their enslaved farmhands that lived there. This is another 1880s view of the front of the Hermitage. And again, this intrigues me. Do you know the history of that chair? It's no longer there because in 1824, this is 2024, so 200 years ago, the Marquis de Lafayette visited Nashville because he saw Andrew Jackson as the lineal political embodiment of the American spirit following George Washington. And Jackson was second only to George Washington in the number of lifetime portraits done of him. Lafayette was almost like an adopted son to George Washington. Washington personally gave his desk chair from Mount Vernon to Lafayette. Lafayette brought it back to America to give to the new savior of America, Andrew Jackson, and it was at the Hermitage. until a number of years later, the ladies decided they would play nice with the ladies of the Mount Vernon Association, and they sent it back to Mount Vernon. This is the tomb where Rachel was buried, and then ultimately President and General Jackson was buried at the Hermitage. We have another presidential tomb in Nashville. This one was designed by William Strickland, and it was near where the corner now is of 7th and Union Street, where that little restaurant is. That was the backyard to Polk Place. Felix Grundy originally owned the entire lot from 7th to 8th and from Church Street to Union. Union was then only an alleyway, it wasn't even a street. So it was safe to put the grave at the back of the lot because it wasn't a busy thoroughfare. But as the city grew more and that became a residential area, and as James died in the 1840s, but Sarah lived till the 1890s with very little incoming finances, she sold most of the property facing the streets to survive. So except for the back end here. And then, of course, the heirs broke President Polk's will. They decided they didn't want a presidential shrine, they wanted cash, so they sold the house to Jacob McGavick Dickinson. And he didn't want somebody else's dead folks in his yard, so the state dug them up and moved them to the state capitol grounds. This is one of the oldest log structures in Nashville. The Dunham Station cabin is out at Belmead, and the Dunhams lived there. There's an Indian raid took place. Mom was outside doing some cooking. The kids were down by the creek playing. The Indians attacked. The kids ran back in. She got back in. She stuck her gun out and was trying to shoot, and fortunately they didn't stick around long enough to do any real damage. But then the Hardings bought it. They lived there briefly until they built the beautiful Belmead Mansion, and they doubled it in size ultimately with an added front to it, but this is still there. And at this point you can see the gentleman, well, you could if the string were down, but right there is Bob Green, the head hostler of Belmead. He's the guy that kept up with all of the bloodlines of the horses and helped maintain the stud farm there. This was the yearlings sales barn. It was where the Belmead apartments are now, across the street from the house, and the inner courtyard to the yearling sales barn. This is the dairy that is still there on the front property at Belmead. And this is one of the first parks in Nashville. This was at 14th and Fatherland Street over in what's now Lockland Springs. It had this gazebo. It had a artificial lake. They had done an impoundment down there. They put castor beans and elephant ears there in an artificial island in the middle, and they even had a monkey cage of all things there in the park. And this was Nashville's one of its very first public parks. This predates Centennial Park even. Nashville City Cemetery 2 years ago celebrated its 200th birthday. It opened in 1822. These are the gates to it, and notice the sign there, a $5 fine. That's huge if you go faster than a walk in your carriage or on your horse through there. Respect the dead and those visiting them here. This is the main street going into the park or the cemetery, because these were seen as parks in that period. People would actually go out there and clean the graves, decorations day. They would leave flowers. Sometimes you would picnic on Grandma as you were visiting out there. And look at the condition of it, though. This is before we had lawn mowers, so you had to hand scythe things usually or have a rotary mower. So it looks very meadow-like in a number of these pictures. This is the biggest monument out there. This is for Governor and General William Carroll. He was a friend of Andrew Jackson's. He commanded the Tennessee troops at the Battle of New Orleans as Jackson was commanding all American forces. And the state of Tennessee honored him with this enormous tombstone out in City Cemetery. Look at the symbolism on it. You've got the American eagle at the top. You have cannon tubes, not columns, cannon tubes holding it up. There's a medieval warrior's helmet. There's a Roman soldier's short sword and an inverted laurel wreath because he has passed on. So on the bases then, you have flaming cannonballs. So it's showing lots of symbolism for his many aspects of his life. This is more of the cemetery. The Gothic marker there is for Robert Baxter. He ran the Cumberland Furnace up around Clarksville. And then the mausoleum is for W.A. Johnson. This is the Felix Grundy plot. And I mentioned Rod Heller being a descendant of Felix Grundy. Back in the 80s, 1880s, as South Nashville was changing, and particularly after 1856, when Mount Olivet opened as a suburban parkland-like cemetery, it became much more fashionable to be buried out at Mount Olivet than to be buried in City Cemetery with the street grid system. So the Grundy descendants decided to dig up Felix Grundy, Anne Grundy, Robert Massengill Porter, and Felicia Grundy Porter, and one of their enslaved people, Ambrose, and one of their dead babies, and move them all out to Mount Olivet. So when I met Rod, I said, well, you know, it's a shame that your ancestors decided to move all those folks, because recently Bill Purcell got us a couple $1 million and we've restored City Cemetery. Mount Olivet is bankrupt, and if something falls apart out there, too bad. And your graves are falling apart. Anne Grundy's is collapsing and Felix is kind of wobbly. So he agreed to help pay to move them all back to City Cemetery.
When was that, Jim?
When did they move them back? About 3 years ago. Interestingly, Rod was doing a talk about Grundy and how he was one of the war eagles, how he was one of the people who thought we ought to go to war with Britain for kidnapping American sailors and making them British tars instead. And so they called them the war hawks. And as Rod was delivering his talk, 3 hawks started circling him up above the cemetery. Woo! This is Ephraim Hubbard Foster's grave. And Ephraim Foster played an important role in one of the other people buried at the cemetery. She was an enslaved person. Sally was owned by a man up in Virginia. And when her owner's brother got her pregnant, he decided to send her down to Nashville, and she could operate here as a quasi-slave. She could open a laundry. And she did, and she kept some of the money. He allowed her to do that. So she decided to try and save up money and buy her children's freedom. So she went to Mr. Foster and Mr. Fogg and got them to deal with the owner down up in Charlottesville, Virginia. And she had given him $300, so the owner said, well, I want $350. So Foster said, done, and bought the young man's freedom. Came back to Sally and said, Sally Thomas, and said, you know, this is Nashville, and there are slave catchers out there. So wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Have him tell everyone he belongs to me. You and I, and he know he doesn't. But that's the reality in Nashville. So Sally then had apprenticed one of her sons to a ship's captain on the Tennessee River down near Muscle Shoals, and he liked the kid, so he manumitted him in his will. And then Sally got word finally that her owner had died, so her remaining child and he, as assets of the estate, were to go back up to Charlottesville and be sold off as part of the property from the estate. So she told the son, run for it. He got as far as Louisville. He was captured by slave catchers up there. But he broke out of jail somehow. He stole a boat, but was swept over the Great Falls of the Ohio. Again, somehow he got out of that, got onto the Indiana shore, and was led to Buffalo, New York, where if the slave catchers came, he just walked across the bridge into Canada and freedom. Sally's children then, when she died in Nashville, put up a marker for her, which was long gone. But one of the things we do at City Cemetery with this place, Fort Negley, is we do on Memorial Day, we do the Memorial Day Dash. It's a 5K, and you can run around Fort Negley and the cemetery, and it makes money for tombstone restoration. And Sally's tombstone was one of those that we paid for with doing that. This is Felix Zollicoffer, poor old Zolly. He was sent up to East Tennessee with Jefferson Davis's belief that being a Whig, maybe he could sway East Tennessee to be loyal Confederates. Didn't work out so well. At Fishing Creek or Mill Springs up there, it was sort of a foggy day, and he took off his glasses, rode up to some guys, gave them orders. Wrong army, you're dead. So he became the first Confederate general to die in the West, and he had a state funeral in the Tennessee state capitol when his body was brought back home. This is one of the drives in the cemetery. Look at the height of the weeds and the foliage there. This is, again, way before we had lawnmowers. And again, that central area where the Keeble building is now the administrative building at the cemetery. The other great cemetery, one of the other great cemeteries, is this one, Mount Olivet. This is the entry gate that the Liggins tore down when they got the notion that they wanted it to look like Christus Gardens at Gatlinburg with giant biblical statues, and we're going to have a big statue of Moses striking the rock and water pouring out of it. Well, they tore it down, they laid the foundation, and that was the end of that. Never happened. As you were going up the hill then, there was a greenhouse because mourners always want to put potted plants or flowers out, don't they? So they could sell them something as they were going out to visit their family. One of the main drives up there, this is one of my favorites, this Moorish Revival marble mausoleum there for the Daniel Carter family. Carter was a banker. He was a loyal Confederate. When the war came along and the feds were occupying Nashville, they marched into his bank lobby and arrested him for not taking the oath of allegiance to the United States. They put him in jail. Grant had seized his house and was living in the Carter house, which was right across the street, Tom, from the new Hermitage Hotel. And ultimately, he did sign the oath of allegiance. And Grant would invite him to come down at his dining table and join the general for dinner. The mausoleum is also sad because their son was killed at Perryville in the Confederate campaign up into Kentucky. And Mrs. Carter and the daughter went up and miraculously found their dead family member and brought his remains back to Nashville for this beautiful mausoleum. Another one of the drives in Mount Olivet. And our final image, Adelicia Ackland's mausoleum. And are all of you familiar with the statue that was inside there? Adelicia did try to take it with her. Her favorite statue was called the Peary. It was by an Irish poet who wrote a poem called Lalla about a fallen Persian angel who, in order to get back into paradise, has to shed 3 tears, regret, remorse, and pity, and bring a goblet of patriots' blood spilled and show them to the pearly gates to get back in. So that's what they're holding. Well, since Adelicia came out of the war with more money than she went into it, some of the older ladies in Nashville weren't too happy with her and started nasty rumors about her poisoning her husbands. So it didn't happen, and that statue was in the mausoleum until recently when Mark Brown finally convinced the family, look, that base it's on is crumbling, it could collapse. This is something that needs to be preserved. So they have allowed it into Belmont Mansion again. There is a replica out at the cemetery now. Any questions? Kim?
Where's the mummy now?
The exhibit designers for the new museum thought it was too sensitive on our delicate sensibilities to put out. So it's in storage.
Is it gonna, it's in storage, how come it doesn't go back to like Egypt or something?
It could, I suppose.
How,
It could, I suppose. It belongs to the Tennessee Historical Society. Yes, sir.
You said the person was appointed, had a political appointment, does that mean he was appointed an officer? Or
Yes.
something with the army?
Yeah, he was an officer. Mm-hmm. And the Hermitage has a nice portrait of him. We used to have it at the old museum near the mummy, so you could tell the story of how it came to be here.
Maybe, did he have any naval experience?
No.
What was his name again?
Jeremiah George Harris. Yes.
Were these cemetery pictures taken at the same time?
Yeah, Otto just seemed to have this burning urge to document the whole city. So there's a couple of hundred of these. There's 2 books I did on them and flipped through those. Carl was actually hired by Adelicia to go out at Belmont and photograph it while she was still living in it.
But I went the grass at Mount Olivet, seems taken care of, but not at the city cemetery.
Yeah.
So were those different?
Yeah, Mount Olivet is private, city cemetery is government.
So there were lawnmowers?
No. You had a rotary lawnmower. You didn't have gasoline engines for lawnmowers yet, so it's very tedious. Remember those old rotary? Yeah, very heavy too. Yes, sir.
What does the term Zollicoffer's barracks mean? Does that mean anything to you?
The burial there?
Barracks.
Oh, barracks. The Maxwell House Hotel was an unfinished construction site, and the Confederates had used it as a barracks for some of their troops in the 6 months that Nashville was Confederate. Of course, following the fall of Nashville, it became a POW camp. And at one point, they were marching some of the POWs down the construction staircase, and it collapsed, and a couple of them died in that collapse. One of the people yesterday at the talk was descended from one of those people. Anybody else? Yeah, Tom.
What became of all the photographs?
Sarah had told me she wanted me to get them, and I told her that's not a good idea. You had already given all of the glass plate negatives, which were essentially studio shots of people, to Metro when they had CETA money, and CETA volunteers cleaned them and put them in acid-free folders. My suggestion to Sarah was you start giving these incrementally and taking tax write-offs over the years to Metro. Well, she never did it. In fact, she didn't have a will that stipulated anything, so her stepchildren sold everything in piecemeal lots through Case Antiques. And I sat with Chuck Sherrill at the auction. This is a good batch bid on it. So most of them are now at the State Library and Archives. These that you saw today were ones that the State Museum acquired through a collection. One of the Sergeant-at-Arms in the Senate had these, and we bought them from him, as well as a bunch of really neat Civil War photographs. Kim?
So the heirs sold, what are we talking about? Are we talking about $1,000, or are we talking about a whole lot of money for the, I mean, that seems ridiculous, as opposed to donating them to the city or the state, right?
And getting a tax write-off.
Right.
Yeah.
So what would, I mean,
It was thousands, it wasn't tens of thousands. Yeah. Yes.
So who is your favorite Nashville figure?
Oh, Lord. I think William Strickland, just because of the 2 buildings that I've got to work on here, and he was so nationally significant. For example, when the Ladies Mount Vernon Association decided that President Washington didn't have grand enough plans for his burial, they could do him one better. They closed down his mausoleum and built a new one, and they hired William Strickland to design the sarcophagus. And he's the one that put the tower on Independence Hall. It wasn't there until he put it there in 1828. So if you ever saw one of those wretched Nicolas Cage movies, National Treasure, when they're up in there, this is where the Patriots hid the papers. It wasn't even here then.
Strickland also never had a home here. He lived in a hotel, right?
And briefly, when Hyman was designing the Adelphi Theater, Strickland had pledged money to help pay for it. He didn't pay his pledge. So he was hiding from creditors, and he left Nashville and moved over onto Jefferson Street and rented rooms there about 3 doors down from where Hyman's house was. That must have been an awkward situation. And it's a restaurant now. And back in the 70s, Louise LeQuire figured all of this out because Strickland had a pet dog who died. Strickland liked monuments, so he designed a little epitaph and tomb for Babs, his puppy. And Louise LeQuire went out there and got the tombstone, and it's at the State Museum.
Wait, Strickland was living on Jefferson Street when he died?
No. He later then went back down to the City Hotel, which
He died there.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, George.
Found his burial spot and is he in the Capitol?
Strickland is in the northeast corner of the Capitol. We think that's probably pride of place where the cornerstone is, if we could ever find it. You know, it's under all of those terraces and some dirt. And then,
You're confident of that now?
oh yeah, it's marked right there. It's in the stone. Another interesting tidbit, George, is on the stone. It says he was born in 1788. He died in 1854. How many years is that? 66. On his tombstone, it says he was 64. In the opposite end of the building, then, is his co-conspirator to get that Capitol built, contrary to what the legislature was not really helping them with. They hoped to get enough appropriations to carry on year-round. The legislature wouldn't do that, so they had to shut down, start. And I think that led to a problem because in some of his testimony, Mr. Morgan refers to Strickland's intemperance. But Morgan is buried in the southeast corner. Yeah.
What happened to Second Presbyterian that Strickland designed? I've always wondered what happened to that church.
I checked with Jim Patrick, who's one of the leading authorities on Tennessee architecture. He did a book with UT on it. And Jim says that in Second's records, it says Hughes was the designer of Second Pres. So that drawing that confused me where it says Second Pres and it's signed by Strickland, he's just doing... No, he's just doing an image of the interior. And back when they were tearing that down in '79 for 12 parking places for the Criminal Justice Center, I got into it, and as far as I know, I have the only color images of the interior of that building. There was a fresco on the wall behind where the lectern would have been, and you could see wooden blocks in the wall to hold up a framework. The painting was you were on the steps or the porch of a temple. You can see columns and then a landscape with the sunburst either setting or rising. And the frame was the doorway, the door frame. And it had parallel galleries on both sides. There were trompe-l'oeil pilasters on the walls. There was a sunken set of aisles on both sides in there. And Standard Candies was using it before that to store goo-goos. Yeah.
Did that have any Egyptian vibe or anything?
No. It was classical revival. Yeah. Anybody else? Second was at Third and Gay. Yeah. Okay.
Is that somebody's ghost on that picture there?
It does look like
Yes. It's Avalicia. What have you done with my statue?
Isn't Nashville lucky to have Jim Hoobler?